Quotations and dialogue rule questions are not that frequent on the new digital SAT. However, they can be some of the most challenging material, some of the trickier questions that you'll find in the standard English convention sections of the reading writing test. If you don't believe me, let me ask you some questions. First, when do you not need a comma before dialogue or quotes? When shouldn't dialogue or quotes begin with a capital letter? When should we put punctuation outside the quotation marks? And what's the deal with dialogue and colons? And when should we use colons in place of commas? If you know the answer to all these questions, or you just don't feel like taking the digital SAT, you can go ahead and give this video a pass. If you're still here, welcome. I'm Will with Principia Tutors and Consultants, and we're about to dive into some fun quotation rules. All right, let's do a quick basic dialogue rule overview with some examples just to get us in the right mental framework. So with direct speech, we introduce the quote with a comma and begin the quote with a capital letter following the quotation marks, unless, of course, the quote begins the sentence. So here, with mom saying, "Don't be rude to your father, children," and then insulting that same father's cooking abilities in a passive-aggressive manner, we see the quote begins the sentence, so we don't need to begin the quote with a comma. Capital letter, of course, because it's the first word of the sentence. And as we move on, there is the exclamation point inside the quote. Exclamation points and question marks go inside the quotes. We would only place a period there if we're ending the sentence with that quotation. Otherwise, a comma would go there in place of a period. Next rule. When we're quoting someone else while speaking, remember to use single quotation marks within the broader quote. So here, with the indignant person starting with, "What do you mean?" The "just found my wallet in your hand by accident" is the indignant individual quoting someone else. So in this instance, the street urchin is being quoted by the indignant individual who is speaking directly. Okay, next rule. With direct speech, any sentence ending with a quote will have the period inside the quotation marks. If the dialogue is interrupted, introduce the rest of the quotation with a comma before the quotation mark, but this time you don't use a capital letter to begin it. So in this example, we're beginning with the quote, "My wonderful robot assistant is letting me know that my request exceeds their program capabilities." And what we can see here is after the comma following "you," we're interrupting the quote, and then before we resume it, there's a comma after "droned." We resume the quote, "Your" does not take a capital Y, and then since the quote ends the sentence, we put the period inside. We've interrupted the dialogue, there's our comma. We've resumed the dialogue, make sure to note that comma. And of course, period is always going inside the quote when the quote ends the sentence. All right, so here are some more challenging dialogue rules. So when we're doing emphasis and quoting outside of direct speech. So when we're repeating word choice from other individuals, emphasizing a word or phrase, or referencing unfamiliar terms, we may not need to introduce the quote with a comma or begin with a capital letter. So this first sentence, when I'm using friends in quotation marks, I'm actually emphasizing that I may not believe these individuals who maintain connection or contact with my brother are actually my brother's friends. When I then reference Dad's label, Dad is not speaking directly, and there's no indication in the sentence to say Dad says or calls, anything to suggest that Dad is speaking right now. And so the nerds with sunlight allergies, again, is an emphasis statement. So I may be repeating my dad's words, but since Dad is not speaking directly and I'm not speaking to him and quoting him, the quotations do not need to be introduced with a comma or begin with a capital letter. And so again, there's emphasis on friends, so no need for a comma or capital letter. And then here, the emphasis, and it's not a complete sentence, so we don't need to introduce with a comma or begin with a capital letter. In this next example with Claire, the eat, pray, love method is in reference to what Claire describes her methodology as. Since I'm not speaking of Claire directly, I'm just quoting her in passing, I do not need to introduce the quotation with a comma or begin with a capital letter. Again, think of this in terms of emphasis. And so, quoting Claire, but she's not in the dialogue directly. The next thing I want to point your attention to is this placement of the question mark. The question mark going outside the quotation mark lets us know the whole sentence is a question, not what's being quoted specifically. All right, now dialogue tags. So when we quote other individuals, we should look for dialogue tags, words like said, declared, exclaimed, shouted, yelled, etc. If these are absent, commas are not required and capital letters should only be used when quoting complete sentences. So some examples. Here, Dad's "don't be a fool" is being heard just by me, but I don't have Dad talking to me directly when I'm tempted to enter that hot dog eating contest. "Don't be a fool" is in of itself an entire sentence, so I do need to begin with a capital letter. However, since Dad is not speaking to me directly, no need for a comma before the don't. Again, note that the exclamation point is inside the quotation marks. So here, complete sentence, no dialogue tag. Hold on to that. In the second example, this is not a complete sentence. The "bad move, bro" here doesn't have a dialogue tag, so I know my sister's not speaking to me directly, and not a complete sentence, so I don't need to use a comma to introduce the quote. Okay, now what if dialogue tags are present? So if these are present, we're going to treat it like with the standard basic dialogue rules. So let's go over an example here. Here, I note the word whisper. That is a dialogue tag. It refers to how something or someone is speaking. So while I might be referring to nature speaking to me, the wind is not technically capable of speech, but in this instance, the dialogue tag lets us know we're treating it like it can literally speak. So let all your cares melt away, introduce it with a comma, begin the sentence for the quote with a capital letter, because "let all your cares melt away" is in and of itself an entire sentence. All right, now with colon usage, there are instances where commas would not be as effective. And so when a colon precedes an incomplete quote or a fragment of a quote, there's no need to begin with a capital letter. So here's an example. What we're seeing here first is the repair skills are being highlighted, so that's a clue. Then after the quote, duct tape, staples, and glue, it's a fragment. It provides an example of repair skills, so another way to confirm that the colon is being used appropriately. And since no one is speaking directly, these quotes are being used for emphasis and again to tie back into the repair skills hint. Okay. Next rule. So if it does precede a quote within its entirety, we need to begin with a capital letter. We don't use a comma, however, because the colon will take over that role. So here, Coach G is going to be quoting from President Roosevelt directly, so we need the colon. Again, we're introducing that. Here, since the quote is in its entirety, we need to begin with a capital letter. And so some are born great, some achieve greatness, some have greatness thrust upon them. What we're seeing, complete sentence, provides an example of Roosevelt's speech, just to tie back into our need for that colon. All right, let's go over a few practice DSAT style questions. So make sure you pause the video after reading through it, attempt it on your own, and then we'll resume after a couple of seconds and we'll go over the correct answers and how to arrive at them. So despite the repeated TSA warnings about the risk of blank, my siblings left their backpacks in the middle of the concourse floor when they saw the display of cake pops. All right, take a couple seconds, give it your best shot. All right, so what we're seeing here with our options, we're beginning the sentence with "despite" as a subordinating conjunction. This clues us into a dependent-independent clause separation. So before "my siblings left," which would establish an independent clause, we need a comma in front of "my." We can eliminate any of the answer choices that do not provide a comma in front of "my." So we get rid of choice D. Up next, we have to consider, are we inside the quotation mark with our commas? If the quotation mark comes before a comma, we've made a grammatical error. Here we have A, which breaks that rule. Get rid of it. Now, we're looking at two options, very similar. The only distinction here is, should we begin with a capital letter or not? In this instance, this is not direct speech or dialogue. If we need a comma before unattended, then that would let us know we're introducing direct speech, and we would need a capital letter to start it. This option is not provided, so we can be very confident in choosing C as our correct answer. Second practice question. Again, After I read through it, pause the video, take some time to attempt it on your own, and then we'll go over how to answer it together. My father says that there are 2 ways to convince even the most suspicious persons of one's relatability. That colon lets us know that we are introducing a quote, and if it is in its entirety, remember the rule associated with it. All right, pause the video. We'll pick up soon. Okay, so here we have very similar sounding options. So reading it aloud and going with a sounds right strategy is not going to help. But what we can draw our attention to is the placement of the period outside the quotation marks for choices B and D. Remember, periods always go inside the quotation mark if the quote ends the sentence. So choices B and D are just wrong. Get rid of them. Now, reading through the sentences and then the options, we'll note that discuss how much you hate traffic or describe how much you love puppies is a complete thought, and it's in the imperative verb mood. So make sure you remember that. As a complete sentence, it needs to begin with a capital letter, which eliminates choice C, meaning A is the correct answer. Here's our third and final DSAT style practice question. Again, just like with the other two, after we read through it, pause the video, attempt to solve it on your own, and then we'll solve it together. As my teenage peers and I prepared to devour the mouth-watering plant-based sandwiches at the vegan restaurant, we couldn't help but giggle when our server exclaimed. All right, what we're seeing here is a dialogue tag with the word exclaimed. It indicates a raised voice. So we need a comma to introduce the quote that would begin with a capital letter. Choice A does not begin with that comma, so we need to eliminate it. Now our remaining choices all have a dialogue tag within the quote, the word shouts. Just like with all dialogue tags, we introduce the dialogue with a comma and begin the quote with a capital letter. However, since this is a quote within a quote, we need single quotation marks for the speaking plant-based sandwich. All right, how do we eliminate from now on? We can get rid of choice C because it's missing that comma. Now this is where it gets a bit tricky, and this is why the dialogue tag we have it indicating raised voice, so pay attention to that. The placement of the exclamation mark at the end of the sentence is the only distinction between choices B and D. Because exclaimed and shouts indicate raised voices, we want the exclamation point inside both sets of quotes. Choice B would only have it suggesting that the server is shouting. However, since the sandwich is described as shouting, we want both sets of speakers to take on that exclamation mark. Choice B, not doing that, is incorrect, leaving us with D, the final most correct answer. That's it for now. Thanks again for watching. Hope you're feeling more comfortable with the DSAT style quotation and dialogue questions. And if you found this useful, please don't forget to like, comment, share, subscribe, and check out our other videos in the DSAT playlist. That's all for now. This is Will with Principia Tutors and Consultants, signing off.